On the morning of August 13th, 1521, the greatest city in the Americas was dying. Tenochtitlan had once risen from the waters of Lake Texcoco like something from another world. Its temples touched the sky. Its markets overflowed with food, cloth, flowers, feathers, precious stones, and gold. Canoes moved through crowded canals. Long causeways connected the island capital to the mainland. Aqueducts carried fresh water into a city larger than many in Europe. Now, bodies filled the streets. Homes had been reduced to rubble. The canals were choked with broken canoes. The survivors were starving. Clean water had almost disappeared. Smoke drifted above ruined temples, and every day the circle around the city grew tighter. Somewhere inside the devastation was Cuauhtémoc, the young ruler who had sworn that Tenochtitlan would not surrender. Outside the city stood Hernán Cortés. Less than 2.5 years earlier, he had reached the coast of Mexico with roughly 500 soldiers. Now he commanded a force large enough to surround the capital of an empire. But most of the warriors fighting beside him were not Spanish. They were indigenous enemies of Aztec power. They came from cities that had paid tribute, lost sons in war, watched their rulers humiliated, or spent generations resisting Tenochtitlan. Cortés had not created their hatred. He had discovered it, organized it, and turned it into a weapon. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not the simple story of a few hundred Europeans defeating millions. It was a story of political division, desperate alliances, miscalculation, epidemic disease, and one of the most brutal sieges in history. And by the time the rulers of Tenochtitlan understood the full danger, it was already too late. Before the Spanish arrived, Tenochtitlan appeared almost impossible to conquer. The city stood on islands in Lake Texcoco. 3 main causeways connected it to the surrounding land. Sections of these causeways could be removed, turning the approaches into deadly gaps filled with water. Canals cut through neighborhoods, allowing people and goods to move by canoe. Aqueducts carried fresh water from the mainland. Chinampas, highly productive farming plots built in the shallow lake, helped feed the enormous population. At the center of the city stood the sacred precinct and the great Templo Mayor. Its twin shrines were associated with Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture. Around it rose palaces, schools, temples, storehouses, and ceremonial spaces. The market at Tlatelolco drew merchants from across Mesoamerica. Food, pottery, tools, medicines, textiles, animals, cacao, tobacco, feathers, and luxury goods changed hands under the watch of officials and judges. To the Spanish soldiers who later entered the city, Tenochtitlan seemed unreal. Some wrote that its towers and buildings appeared like something from a dream. But the beauty of the capital rested on power. The people who dominated Tenochtitlan are often called the Aztecs, though they knew themselves more specifically as the Mexica. Their empire grew from a triple alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Over time, Tenochtitlan became the strongest partner. The empire did not govern every conquered region directly. Local rulers often remained in place, but they were expected to pay tribute. Cotton, cacao, maize, feathers, weapons, labor, luxury goods, and other resources flowed toward the capital. This system made Tenochtitlan rich. It also made enemies. Some communities had been defeated in war. Some resented heavy tribute. Some feared punishment if payments were delayed. Others had remained independent but lived under constant pressure from Mexica power. The empire appeared united from a distance. In reality, it was held together by negotiation, intimidation, military strength, and the belief that resistance was too dangerous. That belief would not survive the arrival of Cortés. Central Mexico was not one nation waiting to unite against foreign invasion. It was a landscape of rival cities, dynasties, alliances, and ethnic communities. Many shared languages and gods, but they could still be bitter enemies. Cortés entered this divided world in February 1519. He sailed from Cuba with 11 ships, several hundred soldiers, a small number of horses, artillery pieces, crossbows, early firearms, sailors, servants, and ambitious men hoping to become rich. It was not an army large enough to conquer an empire by force. Cortés knew that. His expedition had been organized under Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. But Velázquez had become suspicious of Cortés. He feared that his commander would claim the discoveries and wealth of the expedition for himself. He was right. Cortés left Cuba before Velázquez could stop him. From the beginning, the campaign was not only an invasion. It was also an act of political defiance. If Cortés failed, he could be arrested, ruined, or executed. Success was not simply an opportunity. It became his only protection. When the expedition reached the coast, the Spaniards fought local forces near Tabasco. After the battle, they received gifts, including 20 enslaved women. One of those women would become essential to everything that followed. She is remembered as Malintzin, Dona Marina, or La Malinche. Her early life is uncertain, but she spoke Nahuatl, the language used widely across the Aztec world, and a Mayan language. A Spanish priest named Geronimo de Aguilar had survived years in the region and could speak Spanish and Maya. At first, Cortés spoke in Spanish to Aguilar. Aguilar translated into Maya. Malintzin then translated into Nahuatl. Later, as she learned Spanish, the process became faster. But she did far more than repeat words. Translation between rival societies required intelligence, caution, and political understanding. Malintzin explained customs, interpreted warnings, helped negotiate alliances, and allowed Cortés to communicate directly with rulers whose decisions could determine whether his expedition lived or died. Later generations would often condemn her as a traitor. But there was no united Mexican nation for her to betray in 1519. She had also entered the Spanish camp as an enslaved woman with little control over her circumstances. Whatever her private motives were, her ability changed history. Cortés had steel, horses, and gunpowder. Malintzin gave him a voice. On the Gulf Coast, Cortés encountered the Totonacs of Sempoala. Their leaders lived under Aztec pressure and paid tribute to the empire. They complained about demands from Tenochtitlan. Cortés listened carefully. Then he presented himself as a possible liberator. It was a promise he would make repeatedly. He told communities that he had come to end oppression. Yet Cortés did not intend to create an independent Mexico. He intended to bring the land under Spanish authority. For the moment, however, his goals and those of the Totonacs overlapped. Both wanted to weaken Tenochtitlan. Cortés founded a settlement called Villa Rica de la Veracruz. The council of the new town recognized him as Captain General. This legal maneuver allowed him to claim that he served the Spanish crown directly, rather than Governor Velázquez. Then he made retreat almost impossible. Popular legend says Cortés burned his ships. The truth was less dramatic, but the result was the same. Most of the vessels were dismantled, disabled, or sunk. His men could no longer simply sail back to Cuba. They would march inland with him, or they would be left behind. The road toward Tenochtitlan passed through the territory of Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was not part of the Aztec Empire. It was an independent confederation surrounded by territories influenced or controlled by Tenochtitlan. Its people had fought the Mexica for years. They did not welcome Cortés. Tlaxcalan forces attacked the Spaniards and their Totonac allies in a series of hard battles. The Spanish possessed weapons that created shock and confusion. Horses gave them speed. Steel swords caused terrible wounds. Crossbows, firearms, and artillery produced smoke, noise, and fear. But these advantages did not make them invincible. The Spaniards were heavily outnumbered. Their horses were wounded. Their men became exhausted. Supplies were limited. Had the Tlaxcalans continued attacking without negotiation, the expedition might have been destroyed. Instead, Tlaxcalan leaders reconsidered. The strangers were dangerous, but they might also be useful. An alliance with Cortés offered Tlaxcala the chance to strike at its greatest enemy. Peace was arranged. Food entered the Spanish camp. Wounded soldiers recovered. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors would eventually march beside the invaders. This was the moment the balance began to shift. Cortés had arrived with hundreds of soldiers. Now he was becoming the leader of a growing indigenous coalition. Each ally had its own motive. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted relief from tribute. Some hoped to gain territory or political power. Some believed they could use the Spaniards and then control them later. They were not choosing between the Aztec Empire and a future Spanish colonial system they could fully understand. They were making decisions inside the world they knew. In that world, Tenochtitlan was the immediate threat. Cortés was the weapon they believed they could use. They did not yet know that the weapon would eventually turn in every direction. From Tlaxcala, The coalition moved toward Cholula. Cholula was wealthy, sacred, and closely connected to the Aztec world. What happened there remains disputed. Spanish and Tlaxcalan accounts claim that the city was preparing an ambush. Other interpretations suggest that Cortés exaggerated or invented the threat to justify violence. Malintzin was said to have received a warning from a local woman. Cortés gathered Colulan leaders and warriors. Then the killing began. Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies attacked. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, died. Buildings burned. The massacre sent a message far beyond the city. Cortés wanted Moctezuma to understand that his small foreign force was no longer alone. He also wanted every city along the road to understand the price of resistance. The events at Cholula revealed the nature of the campaign. Diplomacy and terror moved together. Cortés offered friendship when friendship served him. When fear appeared more useful, he used fear. News traveled toward Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma II, ruler of the Aztec Empire, had known about the foreigners for months. Messengers watched their movements. Reports described their ships, armor, horses, and weapons. Gifts were sent to them. Gold was among those gifts. Perhaps Moctezuma hoped generosity would persuade the strangers to leave. Instead, the gold confirmed what the Spaniards wanted to believe. Somewhere ahead lay unimaginable wealth. Later stories claimed that Moctezuma believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl. The evidence for this famous story is weak and complicated. Moctezuma may have thought about omens and religious meanings. Politics and religion were deeply connected in his world. But he did not simply mistake armed foreigners for gods and surrender without thought. His actions can also be understood as political caution. He faced an unknown enemy allied with rebellious cities inside his empire. An immediate attack carried risks. Allowing the Spaniards to enter Tenochtitlan might give him time to observe, contain, or control them. Moctezuma was used to foreign rulers entering his capital and recognizing his power. Cortés was not a normal visitor, and the decision to admit him would become one of the most consequential mistakes in history. Across the water, in every direction, temples towered above white buildings. Markets were filled with goods from across the empire. Some Spanish soldiers later wrote that they wondered whether they were dreaming. But beneath the ceremony, both sides were afraid. Moctezuma had allowed armed strangers into the heart of his empire. Cortés had led his men onto an island connected to the mainland by narrow causeways that could be blocked or destroyed. Tenochtitlan was magnificent. It was also a trap. The Spaniards were housed in the palace once associated with Moctezuma's father, Ashiacatl. For several days, the two sides maintained the appearance of friendship. Cortés visited temples and markets. Moctezuma provided gifts and supplies. But the Spaniards were nervous. They were surrounded by a population far larger than their own force. They feared the bridges and the causeways could be removed. They worried food could be cut off. They understood that if Moctezuma ordered an attack, escape might be impossible. Cortés responded with a strategy already used by Spaniards elsewhere. Control the ruler. Control the state. Using the death of Spaniards on the coast as justification, Cortés confronted Moctezuma. The emperor was pressured into moving into the palace where the Spanish were staying. Whether he was seized immediately or gradually lost his freedom remains debated. But the result is clear. Moctezuma became a prisoner inside his own capital. From behind Spanish guards, he continued issuing orders. Tribute still arrived. Nobles still visited. Government continued to function. Yet every day damaged his authority. A ruler who had once seemed distant and sacred was now visibly controlled by foreigners. Cortés tried to govern through him. The arrangement could not last. Spanish soldiers searched for treasure. Gold objects created by skilled artists were melted down so the metal could be divided. Religious conflict grew. Cortés demanded space for Christian worship and condemned Mexica ceremonies while depending on the hospitality of the people performing them. Then news arrived from the coast. Governor Velázquez had not forgiven Cortés. He sent Pánfilo de Narvaez with a larger force to arrest him. Suddenly, Cortés faced destruction from another Spanish army. If Narvaez captured him, the conquest would end. If Cortés left Tenochtitlan, the city might rise against the Spanish garrison. Cortés chose to gamble. He left Pedro de Alvarado in command and marched toward the coast with part of his army. Under cover of darkness and rain, Cortés attacked Narvaez's camp. Narvaez was wounded and captured. Cortés then approached the defeated soldiers with an offer. Join him. March to the richest city they had ever heard of. Share in its gold. Most accepted. Cortés had left Tenochtitlan facing arrest. He returned with a larger army. It should have been one of his greatest victories. But while he had been away, Pedro de Alvarado had made a disastrous decision. During the festival of Tlaxcalans, members of the Mexica elite gathered for a religious celebration. Many were dressed in ceremonial clothing. Indigenous accounts describe them as unarmed. Alvarado later claimed that he feared an attack. Spanish soldiers sealed the exits and attacked the people inside. Nobles, warriors, musicians, and religious participants were killed. The massacre transformed fear into open rebellion. The people of Tenochtitlan surrounded the Spanish quarters. Missiles fell from rooftops. Causeways were threatened. Food became difficult to obtain. When Cortés returned, he did not find a city impressed by his victory over Narvaez. He found a city at war. Cortés demanded that Moctezuma calm his people. The captive emperor was brought before the crowd. What happened next remains uncertain. Spanish accounts claim the crowd rejected him and struck him with stones. Indigenous traditions accused the Spaniards of killing him. Whatever the exact cause, Moctezuma died during the crisis. His death did not restore Spanish control. It destroyed the political shield Cortés had been hiding behind. The Mexica chose Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's brother, as their new ruler. Cuauhtémoc wanted the invaders gone. The Spaniards tried to fight through the city. They fired artillery, attacked buildings, and built crude mobile towers. But the Mexica used the city itself as a weapon. Warriors attacked from rooftops. Canoes moved through the canals. Bridges were removed. Every street could become an ambush. Cortés finally accepted that Tenochtitlan could not be held. The Spanish and their allies prepared to escape at night. They carried portable bridges to cross openings in the causeway. They also carried gold. Cortés ordered royal treasure to be transported. Soldiers were allowed to take what they believed they could carry. Some loaded themselves with heavy bars and ornaments. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the column moved into the darkness. Rain fell over the lake. At first, the escape remained hidden. Then the alarm spread. Canoes filled the water. Mexico warriors attacked from both sides of the causeway. The portable bridge was placed across one of the gaps, but under the weight of men, horses, cannon, treasure, and panic, the crossing collapsed into chaos. Soldiers fell into the lake. Some were pulled down by the gold they refused to abandon. Horses screamed. Gunpowder became wet. Indigenous allies were trapped beside the Spaniards. Bodies and broken equipment filled the gaps. Survivors climbed over wreckage and the dead. Many never reached the mainland. The retreat became known to the Spanish as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. To the Mexica, it was a victory. They had driven the invaders from their capital. Cortés lost men, horses, weapons, and nearly all the treasure taken from Tenochtitlan. His expedition was wounded, exhausted, and exposed. If his indigenous allies had abandoned him, the invasion probably would have ended there. But the Tlaxcalans did not abandon him. Their decision changed history. Tlaxcala had suffered terrible losses during the retreat. Its leaders had reasons to distrust the Spaniards. Yet peace with Tenochtitlan might have left Tlaxcala isolated and vulnerable. The alliance with Cortés was dangerous. Breaking it might be even more dangerous. The survivors fought their way toward Tlaxcalan territory. Near Otumba, they faced another major Mexica army. Cortés and his cavalry attacked the enemy command position. The Spaniards and their allies escaped again. When Cortés finally reached safety, he was no longer the confident visitor who had entered Tenochtitlan. He was the commander of a defeated army. But he was alive, and he had learned the lesson that would determine the next campaign. Tenochtitlan could not be controlled from inside. It had to be isolated, surrounded, and destroyed from the outside. While Cortés rebuilt his coalition, another invader entered the city. It carried no sword. It demanded no gold. And no Mexico warrior knew how to fight it. Smallpox had arrived. The disease entered a population with no previous exposure and no inherited immunity. It spread through homes, temples, palaces, and military units. Victims developed fever, weakness, and painful eruptions across the body. Entire families became sick. People who might have cared for the ill were themselves infected. Food production and transport were disrupted. Warriors could not stand. Leaders died. The epidemic did not defeat Tenochtitlan by itself. The Mexica continued resisting. But the disease weakened the city at exactly the moment Cortés was preparing to return. Cuitlahuac, the ruler who had driven the Spaniards out, died after only a short reign. Leadership passed to Cuauhtémoc. He was young, determined, and faced with an almost impossible task. He had to rebuild the military strength of a city devastated by disease. He had to hold together allies who might defect. He had to prepare for the return of an enemy who now understood Tenochtitlan's defenses. Cuauhtémoc attempted to strengthen loyalty across the empire. He sought support from tributary cities. He fortified the causeways. He prepared warriors. But the political landscape was changing. Every city that joined Cortés made the coalition stronger. Every city that abandoned Tenochtitlan made the capital more isolated. Cortés sent messages, threats, and promises. Communities around the Valley of Mexico calculated which side seemed more likely to win. Some joined him willingly. Others joined under pressure. Texcoco, one of the original members of the Triple Alliance, became a crucial base for the campaign against Tenochtitlan. The empire was no longer fighting only foreigners. It was being dismantled by a regional war in which the Spaniards had become one powerful faction. Cortés then prepared the weapon that would neutralize Tenochtitlan's greatest defense: the lake. 13 brigantines were constructed under Spanish direction with enormous indigenous labor. Timber was cut. Components were transported over difficult terrain. The vessels were assembled and launched at Texcoco. These ships could carry soldiers and cannon. They could challenge Mexica canoes, protect troops on the causeways, and cut supplies moving across the water. The fleet that had brought Cortés to Mexico was gone. But he had built a new fleet in the mountains. This time, he would not enter Tenochtitlan as a guest. He would return as a besieger. By the spring of 1521, the coalition surrounding Cortés had become enormous. The Spanish still numbered only in the hundreds. But tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, porters, laborers, boatmen, and suppliers participated during different stages of the campaign. Exact numbers vary. The central truth does not. Indigenous forces formed the overwhelming majority of the army attacking Tenochtitlan. Without them, the siege would have been impossible. Cortés divided the coalition along the major causeways. Pedro de Alvarado advanced from Tlacopan. Cristobal de Olid moved from Coyoacán. Gonzalo de Sandoval operated from Iztapalapa. Cortés directed operations on the lake. The objective was not a single heroic assault. It was strangulation. The aqueduct carrying fresh water from Chapultepec was cut. Routes carrying food into the city were attacked. Canoes attempting to bring supplies across the lake faced the brigantines. Communities around the valley were conquered, persuaded, or forced to support the coalition. The circle tightened. Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. Mexico warriors defended every approach. They placed sharpened stakes beneath the water to damage the brigantines. They used canoes for surprise attacks. They opened gaps in the causeways and concealed them. When Spanish cavalry charged forward, horses could plunge into the water. The causeways became killing grounds. During the day, Cortés's forces advanced. At night, the Mexica often returned and rebuilt defenses. Cortés realized that capturing streets was not enough. The buildings behind the advancing army had to be destroyed. Homes were torn down. Rubble was used to fill canals and gaps. The city's own architecture became material for its destruction. Every advance made Tenochtitlan harder to defend. It also made it less recognizable. This was not simply a battle for control. It was the physical erasure of a capital. The defenders launched repeated counterattacks. Spanish soldiers were captured. From a distance, their companions could sometimes see prisoners being taken toward the temples. Drums sounded across the city. The psychological effect was terrifying. Some allied warriors began to wonder whether the gods still favored the Mexica. At one point, a major Spanish attack ended in disaster after troops advanced too quickly and failed to secure the gaps behind them. Mexica forces counterattacked. Spaniards and allies were trapped. Cortés himself was nearly captured. The defeat proved that the defenders could still strike. But their victories could not reopen the aqueduct. They could not restore the destroyed neighborhoods. They could not replace the people weakened by disease and hunger. Time belonged to the besiegers. Inside Tenochtitlan, conditions became catastrophic. Clean water disappeared. Food supplies collapsed. People drank contaminated lake water. Bark, insects, roots, and anything remotely edible were consumed. The wounded lay beside the sick. Corpses could not always be removed. The smell of death spread through the surviving districts. Yet Cuauhtémoc continued fighting. Surrender offered no guarantee of survival. The Mexica remembered Cholula. They remembered the massacre during Tlaxcalans. They had seen Moctezuma become a prisoner. Many believed defeat would bring humiliation, enslavement, or death. Resistance was not based on ignorance. It was based on the knowledge that the world they understood was disappearing. The fighting moved toward Tlatelolco. The great market that had once amazed the Spaniards became a battlefield. Neighborhood by neighborhood, the defenders were compressed into an ever smaller space. The brigantines controlled the lake. The causeways were filled. Buildings fell. Cortés sometimes offered terms. Cuauhtémoc refused. Neither side trusted the other, and neither believed a peaceful future waited beyond the ruins. After nearly 3 months, Tenochtitlan had become a shattered island crowded with starving survivors. Then came August 13, 1521. Fighting continued through the ruined districts of Tlatelolco. Civilians attempted to escape across the water. Canoes pushed away from the city. Among those trying to leave was Cuauhtémoc. His canoe was intercepted. The young ruler was taken before Cortés. Later accounts describe him facing the conqueror with dignity. He had defended his city. He had been captured. When news of his capture spread, organized resistance collapsed. The surviving population began leaving the city. The scene horrified even some of the men responsible for creating it. The once great capital was filled with ruined homes, poisoned water, unburied bodies, and people barely able to walk. Victory did not look glorious. It looked like the death of a world. The Aztec Empire had fallen a little more than 2 years after Cortés reached the Mexican coast. But the phrase Cortés conquered the Aztecs hides more than it explains. Spanish weapons mattered. Steel swords were devastating in close combat. Horses gave the conquistadors mobility and shock power. Brigantines allowed them to dominate the lake. Gunpowder weapons created fear and could break formations. But none of these advantages allowed 500 men to defeat an empire alone. Cortés had entered Tenochtitlan once with hundreds of Spaniards. The city had nearly destroyed him. He succeeded only after returning with a massive indigenous coalition. The first great cause of the empire's fall was political division. The tribute system had created enemies. Tlaxcala had resisted Aztec power long before Cortés arrived. Totonac leaders wanted relief from tribute. Rival factions within Texcoco saw opportunity in the conflict. Cortés did not create every grievance. He connected them. He convinced separate enemies of Tenochtitlan to fight at the same time. The second cause was disease. Smallpox killed leaders, weakened warriors, disrupted families, and shattered the city's ability to recover. Cortés did not understand viruses. He could not have planned the epidemic, but his campaign benefited from it. The third cause was adaptation. Cortés survived defeat and changed his strategy. Instead of trying to control the city through Moctezuma, he attacked its water, food, transport, and alliances. Instead of relying only on troops moving over land, he built ships. Instead of charging directly into the city, he destroyed it block by block. The fourth cause was the determination of the indigenous coalition fighting beside him. Tlaxcalans, Texcalans, Totonacs, and warriors from many other communities paid an enormous price during the conquest. They provided soldiers, supplies, transport, labor, and local knowledge. Some believed the fall of Tenochtitlan would create a better political order. For a time, certain allies received privileges, but they did not control what came next. The Aztec tribute empire was replaced by Spanish colonial rule. Christian churches rose where temples had stood. Mexico City was built over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Indigenous communities faced new forms of tribute, forced labor, land loss, religious suppression, and epidemic disease. The allies who helped defeat the Mexica had changed the balance of power, but they had not decided who would rule the new world. Cortés had promised liberation from one empire. What followed was another. Cuauhtémoc remained a prisoner. The Spanish tortured him while searching for hidden treasure. Years later, during an expedition to Honduras, Cortés ordered his execution after accusing him of conspiracy. Malintzin continued serving as an interpreter and intermediary. Cortés became governor and captain general of New Spain, though political rivals later challenged his authority. The Spanish crown benefited from the conquest while remaining suspicious of the man who had carried it out. Cortés gained wealth and fame, but he never achieved the uncontested power he wanted. History transformed him into many different figures: explorer, conqueror, strategist, destroyer. The truth contains parts of all of them. He was bold, intelligent, ruthless, and extraordinarily fortunate. He knew how to persuade people who wanted different things to fight for the same immediate goal. He survived mistakes that killed thousands around him. And he understood something that rulers often discover too late. An empire can appear strongest just before its enemies realize it is standing alone. Moctezuma is also remembered through myth. Some portray him as weak. Others imagine him paralyzed by superstition. But he faced a situation no ruler before him had encountered. Foreign soldiers had arrived from beyond the known world. They possessed unfamiliar animals and weapons. They were forming alliances with local enemies. Attacking them immediately might have united more rebels against him. Allowing them into the capital might have offered a chance to control them. Moctezuma chose caution. Cortés turned caution into captivity. Cuauhtémoc chose resistance. The siege turned resistance into ruin. Neither decision could reverse the deeper transformation already underway. The arrival of the Spaniards connected central Mexico to a violent Atlantic world of conquest, commerce, slavery, Christianity, and epidemic disease. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not the final conquest of every indigenous society in the region. Spanish expansion continued for generations. Many communities resisted. Some negotiated. Some preserved their languages, identities, and traditions despite colonial pressure. The people of Mexico did not disappear with the empire. Their descendants remained. Their cultures survived, changed, and endured. Nahuatl is still spoken. Indigenous traditions remain part of modern Mexico. Beneath the streets of Mexico City, archaeologists continue to uncover the remains of the capital Cortés attempted to erase. Stone walls, offerings, temples, objects once held by people who lived through the final days. Tenochtitlan was destroyed, but it was never completely silenced. And that may be the greatest mistake in the traditional story. The fall of the Aztec Empire is often described as an impossible European victory. 500 men against millions. Steel against stone. A modern army against an ancient world. The real story is far more complicated. The empire fell because its enemies were already waiting. Because disease arrived before anyone understood what it was. Because Cortés learned from defeat. Because indigenous armies decided the outcome. And because the defenders of Tenochtitlan were slowly deprived of water, food, allies, and space until courage was no longer enough. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured on the waters of Lake Texcoco. The temples were silent. The markets were gone. Smoke drifted over the ruins of a city that had once seemed eternal. Cortés had won, but the victory belonged to a coalition whose members imagined very different futures. The world they created would not belong equally to them. History remembers the handful of Spaniards who entered Tenochtitlan. It often forgets the thousands of indigenous warriors who brought them back. It remembers the weapons. It forgets the politics. It remembers the conquest. But it rarely remembers the cost. Tenochtitlan did not fall because its people lacked courage. It fell because an empire surrounded by enemies was attacked by nearly all of them at once. And by the time its rulers understood that this was not another rebellion, there was no empire left to save. For more cinematic stories about the empires, betrayals, and battles that changed the world, subscribe to the channel. Did Cortés defeat the Aztec Empire through military genius, or did he simply arrive at the exact moment its enemies were ready to destroy it?